Welcome back. Reading week finally over, thank goodness, and we can get back to social psychology. I hope you're excited about this as much as I am. I spent a little bit of time thinking about our module in the last week with Yasmin and Connie as well, and I want to start with that, talking a little bit about the feedback, just to kind of acknowledge what you told us and to give you an impression. I think I sent around an email. I also have a little bit of a section on this week's module section on the feedback, and you can see we read all of your feedback. Thank you so much. So many answered. We looked at it, we thought about it, we're still thinking about it. It's we're trying to improve the module as we go along. But let me just quickly share my screen, and then I can show you a little bit of what I'm talking about. You can see here, I think, if you go down on this week's section, we start with more details about the feedback, and you can kind of see and get an impression. But let me talk about what you told us, what we feel like you told us, our interpretation. I'm not sure why this is not starting, but it will eventually. Here we go. Okay, so this is my personal Sedekides feedback corner. Finally, I get some feedback, even though I have to deliver it myself. As I said, this is just a snapshot. There's all the results. We analyzed all of them. They're all on Moodle. I also shared them with other people in the department, just so that they're aware of what is going on in our module. Overall, I think we're very happy with the results, and I think it seems like that you guys are quite satisfied with how the module is going. So if this would be basically an evaluation of the course, not just the psychology program at City, not just the module, then we would have basically the highest student satisfaction numbers in the country. But this is obviously just social psychology. These are the kind of the three. I think you're happy with the whole module, the seminars, and the lectures overall. I think one student said that they are not satisfied with the module. Obviously, that's the student that I want to talk the most to and kind of figuring out what is going wrong. But most of you guys at least said that you're satisfied with the module. But this is not kind of like, I mean, the key exercise of this module or of this feedback was not to make us feel good about ourselves, but to kind of learn and see like, okay, how can we improve? I think it became, for most of this, we ask you about what do you not like about, basically, or if you could change one thing about Moodle, lectures, seminars. I think these are the three key things we ask about. And now on the next slide here, I kind of distilled what you said and how we think we should respond, what I call like key negative feedback or things where you thought like we could improve them. I think the first one was the videos earlier. There was one, the additional videos you want to have earlier. I think for me in my schedule, the earliest I can deliver them would be by Monday. So this is now what we're going to do. I will upload them later today so that you at least have at the end of the day all of these videos up there. Otherwise, I can't see how I could do that earlier without not spending my Sunday on doing these things. I hope that's fine. I hope that is better. I think most of you have some version of that. More slides and more words on slides. This is something I get whenever I teach. I think I do not want to have more slides on and more words on my slides, as you might suspect, but I understand. I think it was probably like 25 students commented in one of these sections that they want to know more or want to have some kind of more writing on it. So one of you guys suggested, which I really liked, is like, okay, I said like, okay, we can have more words under the slides. So if you kind of, I think if I look at this, if you look at the slides here, I now put in the comments, not in the comments, in the notes, in the notes, I put text in there. And I think this is the first time I did that. And for this week, so if you download the slides, you can see that in each of these slides has additional text underneath them. And I hope that this will help you to kind of figure out what's the most important aspect of the slides that I present and what I'm saying. I'm happy to kind of like, if you feel like, I wish you would do this one more thing, then please write me. I'm always kind of like trying to improve my teaching and the module. But this is kind of the key response where I think like, okay, let's put more words under the slides. So this, our lectures do not become exercises in like reading text on slides together and me aloud and you silently along. But this is a little bit more entertaining and a little bit more engaging, but still you have this advantage of knowing more or having more text underneath them. Slow down. I just looked at what I got as a feedback last year. One of them was slow down. I try. I will try to slow down a little bit in lectures, just cut a little bit of content. I understand that some of this might feel like, oh my God, there's so much I want to get through. And that kind of, I don't know, might make the listener slightly stressed. I don't want that. So I try to cut back a little bit on the content and try to slow down and explain it in a little bit more detail. So I have that. Seminars. So this is the last one. This is a little bit hard because I mean, the key feedback on the seminars was that most of you, I think about 15 students said, I wish the other students would participate more. And I mean, in some ways, I feel like that's a little bit on us. We're thinking, okay, how can we make these exercises so that people are more likely to engage, but it's a little bit also on you guys, where I feel like, okay, you're all grown-ups, you have to find your ways to motivate yourself, and you have some kind of, I don't know, role to play in these seminars to make sure that you participate. So we will continue to try and make the group works as engaging as we can. We try this every week. We will try to do so. Overall, I'm very happy with the feedback and the group work I get from the seminars. I think these seminars are as active as I think I've never had that many active seminars in social psychology. But I think there's like the key problem that, okay, sometimes we have a group work and it seems like we're not talking enough with each other, and we'll try to kind of address that in the upcoming seminars. But that was the key negative feedback about our seminars. Okay. I hope that gives you a feeling we're kind of like we're listening to you and trying to improve and trying to better ourselves, and gives you a little bit of a feel where we are standing. Okay, so we have 5 more weeks. We're a little bit over the halfway point now, and we are talking this week about racism and prejudice. I was thinking like, oh, I could easily teach a whole module on racism and prejudice. There's so much, and especially in social psychology, there's a really long tradition. One of the key starting points of social psychology was our interest in trying to understand racism and prejudice. So let me start with a little bit of an overview of what we're trying to do this week, what I'm trying to kind of help you understand. I mean, when we talk about racism or prejudice, so I will probably most often call it prejudice, is this idea that you have a certain type of attitude towards another person just because they're a member of a group, right? And this doesn't need necessarily be based on ethnicity. It could be on gender, on sexual orientation, and so forth, right? And you remember last week we talked about attitudes, and Alpert said, oh, we should define social psychology as the research on attitudes. And this was one of the key areas he was thinking about. And he defined it in his kind of seminar work, sorry, on the nature of prejudice. He said like that prejudice is, racism is a hostile or aversive attitude toward a person, right, who belongs to a group simply because they belong to that group, right? So whenever you see someone and you're just like, oh, Andreas is a man, you have a certain attitude towards me based on that. It comes with certain ideas you have about who I am and what I'm likely to do and what my character is and if I'm trustworthy and so forth. Okay, so this is when we talk about prejudice in social psychology and racism. Most often what we think about is that this is a specific attitude towards people, right? So we're building really on last week. Upsala. Oh, this is okay. So I just want to kind of highlight a little bit, like, why do we think is the attitude here the key, right? And we talked about this last week. I just want to kind of recap that a little bit. There's the theory of planned behaviors. One example of these powerful theories that suggests that one of the key predictors of our behavior towards others, but any type of behavior, is the attitude we have, right? So hence they think, okay, so we are really interested in the attitudes people have. And the other things, norms and behavior control, which we talked a little bit about last week, these are things that either hinder or enable the expression of, for instance, hostile attitudes towards people from a certain ethnic group, okay? But what we really want to kind of know is what type of attitude people have, and we want to know that because we think that this will help us to explain their behavior, okay? So in the traditional sense of the theory of planned behavior, once I know your attitude, I have a really good understanding of how you will behave towards a certain group. Okay, it's important to kind of note that attitudes are more than just kind of like evaluations. We talked about this last week or like 2 weeks ago, so it might be good to kind of remind ourselves, but there's an affective, a behavior, and a cognitive component, right? So attitudes are in themselves composed and complex, right? It's not just, oh, I don't like man, right? There's much more. There are certain behaviors and cognitions that come along with that as well. So you can kind of translate that into the kind of ABC of prejudice, right? Where you think like, okay, let's think about what it would mean. Let's think about if you think about me as a man, or like you see a male student, right? Okay, so you might have a certain type of effective component, effective reaction to that, based obviously on whether you're a man or you're not a man, or you're male or female. So that will help to kind of like or shape your responses to that male student. But it also will come with some kind of ideas you have about the ability. So for instance, lecturers might come in and see male students who traditionally in the UK and in the US struggle very much with academic performance. And I was thinking, oh, okay, there's Andreas, he's male. And then I might already suspect that, okay, he might not be that good at psychology. And this will, so there's a certain type of cognitions that I have then about the student immediately just based on their gender. It could also be obviously based on their race or based on their sexual orientation. And this will shape my behavior, right? I might think like, oh, Andreas, he's probably not very good. Hence, I should maybe not provide him with additional content. Hence, I should kind of maybe not ignore him a little bit in a seminar, because I have very low expectations about what he might be able to achieve in the seminar. So it comes that these attitudes have affective, behavioral, and cognitive components as well, okay? Just to keep that in mind. So now, one question that arises is to kind of think about, okay, so how, like, we have these attitudes, we can measure them. Psychology is really obsessed, social psychology in particular, with measuring attitudes. What do we know? Is there, like, how racist are our societies? How widespread is it? And do we see any change? So this is a slide here of basically of research from the 1930s in the US to 2015 almost, about some key explicit attitudes, right? What we talked about last or 2 weeks ago, how to measure them, right? Here's like some key attitudes people have, right? This is like, I think for me always when you kind of read them, it's a little bit like sobering to remember that for not too long ago, in our parents' generation, it was pretty okay in order in some ways to think that, do you think that like not like that white and black students in the US should go to the same school or to separate schools, that you approve or disapprove of marriage between black and whites, that you think there should be laws against marriage between black and whites, right? And you can see that, for instance, if you're interracial marriage, right, the approval of that in the 1950s in the US is basically like almost 0%, right? Nobody in the 50s thinks like it's a good idea. There should be a law, okay, against that. And now you think like basically this has completely changed. I mean, it's surprising there's still in the 2000s like this is like, sorry, this is the interracial, like how do you feel about interracial marriage, right? Which is like you see in the 1950s, basically everybody disliked it. And now nobody has a problem with that. They approve of that, okay? So in some ways you can see the same trend with these explicit attitudes all over the world. You can see it in the UK, you can see it in other countries in Europe, you can see it, similar developments in other countries in the world, where if we ask people, how do you feel about another group, how do you feel about certain hot topics that are related to prejudice and racism, that if you ask people explicitly, that people then say, oh, I have relatively good positive attitudes towards this issue. Now, in some ways you can think, okay, following the theory of planned behavior, now that we see that everyone basically has kind of like these positive attitudes, then racism is over, right? Racism is solved here, I put provocatively. Sorry. But obviously, if you have kind of eyes, if you perceive your perceptive around you, you know that this is like this is a provocative question, and that is the answer is probably no, right? We still have similar problems, but how is this possible, right? How, if there are such positive attitudes, how can it be that there is maybe not an improvement in the behavior, yet only in these explicit attitudes, right? We talked about it a little bit last week or 2 weeks ago, sorry, when we talked about this research by Lapierre, that it was the opposite here, but that often our attitudes, especially when it comes to racism and prejudice, might not be the best predictor of how we act towards another member, a member of another group. So this is kind of like where social psychologists in the 80s and 90s were somewhat stuck, and they're like, okay, how can we explain that? Why do our attitudes not predict that anymore? Norms have changed. Behavior control might not be a real issue here. The attitudes have changed. Why do people not behave more positively? Oh, sorry. One of these kind of seminal articles on this topic is by John DeVideo. You will come across him later on, and what he did is like he did these two he basically did the same study in 1989 and 1999, and what he does is basically he gave either human resource managers or study participants two profiles, CVs, and description of their abilities from always a white and a black candidate. And they were asked to indicate, okay, whom would you select? Okay, here's the description of a black job candidate. Here's the description of a white job candidate. Whom would you give the job, right? In some conditions, sometimes the answer was obvious. One was clearly more qualified than the other. And there are these cases where it's unclear, okay? Where it's not really obvious whether you should hire the black or the white job candidate. And this is where we think really racism takes place. So if you kind of look at this slightly overwhelming, let me just grab a pen here. Slightly overwhelming table, then you see here, this is basically the kind of explicit attitudes where we ask like, okay, black and white candidates, how do you perceive their qualifications, right? And here you can kind of like the percentage recommended, right? And you can basically see that if there's a clear, strong qualification, so if either the white candidate is clearly the better one or the black, then you can see that basically in like 1989 and 1999, people take basically these HR managers, they take the stronger candidate. They take the person, or they would take, this is a hypothetical decision, they would take the stronger one, right? But here you see, and this is really where it's interesting, there's this ambiguous qualifications, right? Where it's not really obvious who's the better one, right? And now what you can see is this massive gap, okay? Now, if these white HR managers, if it's kind of a little bit like, it's unclear to say, then in 75% of the cases, they would go with the white candidate. Interestingly, you see an improvement from 89 to 99 in how they, evaluate the explicit attitudes. So if you ask him about their explicit attitudes, if you ask him how do you think capable are black or white job candidates in general and so forth, what you can see is that from 1889 to 1989 to 1999, there's a real marked improvement in the perceptions of black job candidates. But that doesn't really, you can see here, the gap still remains. It doesn't really translate into the behavior. So we have this kind of weird disconnect where we can see in other areas in our life where people say one thing and do another thing. Okay, where we explicitly say, oh, I don't see color, or I perceive black candidates at least as good as white candidates. But then if it becomes a little bit ambiguous, then it seems like our biases really play out. And we act racist, okay? So this is basically the puzzle we are trying to solve today. How can it be? And the answer, right, there's like, okay, I don't want to talk too much about it. We talked a little bit when we talked about Sarah Avenard and her case, right? There's this kind of weird toxic behavior that we can't get rid of. Right? Where you think like, how can we get rid of these behaviors? It seems like all our informational campaigns achieved what we wanted to achieve. Attitudes have changed, but still the behavior hasn't. How can that be? Right? And one of the answers is this idea of the unconscious bias. That, okay, the answer here is that you and I, what we have is like, we have this bias in us, okay, who knows where it came from, right? But that unconsciously drives our behavior. So these HR managers, they're basically by this unconscious force within them are driven to select the white over the black candidate when the situation is ambiguous, even though they claim that they do not have racist attitudes towards black candidates, okay? And this is like, if you look over the media, right, this is just here some examples. Unconscious bias is basically everything around our understanding now about about racism is centered around unconscious bias. There are many, many misconceptions, and I will explain all of these misconceptions today and in additional videos as well, starting from whether this is actually an unconscious bias or not and what it does predict, okay? But I think as a psychologist, it's super important to understand what is meant with that and how it actually relates to behavior. And this is something people want to talk to you. And if you participate in any type of anti-bias training, here's a very famous example from Starbucks where they try to basically overcome the racist behaviors of some of their employees by giving them anti-bias training. This training was done 2 years ago to all of the employees in Starbucks in the US in order to counter it. And then the question is, okay, does that actually work? Does that improve behavior? Does anti-bias training work? And we will have that in the additional videos as well. I just want to highlight that often nowadays, I think I kind of talked a little bit like in a black and white, it might not be the best metaphor in this context here, but just like in this kind of, things have not changed, behavior have not changed. It is important to highlight that a lot of things in a lot of areas, things have quite dramatically changed. For instance, education as one of the battlegrounds on prejudice and racism. What you can see is that there is, when you look at now, how are students in the UK performing, right? You can see that Chinese students and Asian students outperform white students in math and English, okay? So there's a clear, you can see the importance of being a member of a certain group, which we talk next week about, and how can that be that there are some, this is important in the chat. Okay, so yes, I think there's a question about changing unconscious bias. We will talk about this in the additional videos, I'm afraid. I try to kind of highlight this again. Thanks for the question. I don't think that the bias is unconscious, which I will tell you at the end of today's lecture, okay? But yes, we can change our attitudes and we can change that, but it might be more tricky than we hope it would be, okay? But you can also see that, so here you can say, like, if you just focus on a black race, like, okay, white students perform better than black students in math and English, and you can kind of stop there. But if you look at other indicators of how are, for instance, Black students doing. If you look at progress overall at the end of the key stage, then you see that in the UK, white students actually have the worst performance overall. And if you see who's going to university, you can also see that white students are basically at the bottom. So if out of 100 white students, only 30 go to university. When you can then compare that to Black, Asian, or Chinese, you can see that the percentages are very higher. This can often doesn't necessarily mean the same thing. I think you can still be discriminated against. You can still experience prejudice, as I'm sure many of these Chinese, Asian, and Black students experience from their teachers. But there's some things have dramatically changed over the last 20 years. So it's not all bleak. That's basically what I want to tell you here. There is some progress made within our societies over the last decades, and maybe some of the work at least is paying off. Okay. So I want to start a little bit with kind of reviewing what we know about already and kind of connecting the topic today to what we learned in the last weeks, just to show you that we are not reinventing with every week the topics, right? We're having already a lot of really good building stones in our arsenal, and now we are trying to we can apply them to the topic of racism as well. And then I want to talk a little bit about the implicit measures of prejudice. This is the more academic term for these unconscious bias measures, and I want to first kind of explain to you how they work and what we know about them. And then I want to talk about two misconceptions about them, in particular, why we think or why so many people claim this is an unconscious bias, and if it's actually an unconscious bias or not, and how we can test that. And then in the additional videos, we will have the second part about these misconceptions, and we will talk about, and this was Alicia's question, we will talk about unconscious bias training. What could we do to change these biases, and does it actually work? Okay, so just a quick review of what we already know, okay? And I just want to say, okay, this is not like we're building each week on the knowledge of the weeks beforehand, and you can think a little bit about racism and prejudice as more of an applied topic within social psychology, right? Like a specific problem that we want to solve. So we know, for instance, from self and identity that one of the key drivers we have is self-enhancement, right? I want to feel good about myself. And one of the key aspects we have of our identity is our group membership, right? Remember, I think about more than 60 or 70% of Americans said that the most important aspect of their self is that they are American, right? And here you can see research by Konstantin Sedikidis and others, where they basically see okay, are our parts of our identity, our group identity, protected by the same mechanisms as we have looked at when we talk about this kind of mimic neglect and self-enhancement, talking about just our own personal self, right? And what you can see is that the mimic neglect works as well for the groups. So I will, if for instance, I learned something about Germans, me being a German, if that's an important aspect of my identity, then I would learn really good from positive feedback. If somebody says something nice about Germans, I would agree and remember that. But if somebody says something negative about Germans, I would simply forget about that. So it seems like that part of racism and prejudice is we want to feel better about ourselves, hence we want to put down other groups, and B, it is protected by the same mechanisms, what we call like this psychological immune system that protects other aspects of ourselves, okay? So part of that seems to be really ingrained in self and identity. The second one is that we talked a little bit about person perception, right? We touched on stereotypes there already. We talked a little bit about, okay, whom do we perceive as trustworthy? Whom do we perceive as honest, as warm? Whom do we want to interact with? One of the key bits is familiarity, right? It sounds a little bit innocuous. It's like, oh, familiarity, who cares? But it's really important if you think about in-group and out-group behavior, if you think about whom we know or who looks familiar to us. These are the people that we often interact. That's with our group. And hence, if we look at the people in our group, we feel like, oh, she, he just looks really trustworthy. And then we encounter somebody from the out group whose face we're less familiar with. And we immediately feel then that that person looks less trustworthy. We talked about this at length, and I don't want to go into that as well, but that's like how the warmth and competence shape our behavior when we perceive members of groups, right? This kind of stereotype model of social evaluation that we introduced when we talked about social perception in week 3. It's also important to kind of remember how warmth and competition are shaped, right? If I perceive a group as in competition with my own group, then I will immediately perceive them as less trustworthy, as less honest, and hence as less warm, right? So there are already kind of these connections built in. How does my drive the evaluation of another person based on these kind of key dimensions we had in week 3? We talked in week 4 about social explanation, right? We talked about what was then called the fundamental attribution error, right? How I or we have as persons have the tendency to explain our own negative behavior, for instance, in terms of situation, and the negative behavior of other people in terms of character. So if Yasmin does something bad, then I think she's a bad person. If I do something bad, I say I'm stressed, right? And you can see the same for positive and negative events when we talk about the locus of control and the controllability. Here, this is research by Pettigrew, or it's not research, it's actually a review article where he suggests, okay, we also do that with other groups, right? So we use these same kind of defensive mechanisms to protect ourselves, also wire social explanations also to explain this for the behavior of groups, right? You might think about, you see something in the news, you wonder, why are they doing this? And then you use the character of that group in order to explain this to yourself. Okay, so there's another, he calls that the ultimate attribution error for the person itself. It's just like the fundamental attribution error. And we talked about that in detail in one of the additional videos. So that's also something we already know, okay? How racism might work as a wire social explanation. And I just want to quickly mention, as we already said that, right, you can kind of think about everything we talked about last week about attitudes applied to prejudice and racism, because that is a specific attitude and how it relates to behavior, okay? So now let's talk about implicit measures of prejudice. And I think just to kind of recap here, I don't know if I have that something. Okay, so the key problem that I alluded at the end of my little introduction was to say, okay, it seems like on the one hand, racist behavior is not as low as we wish it to be. Racist behavior is still there. It's really persistent in certain areas of our society. Yet if we look at the explicit attitudes, as we directly ask people, then we don't see any negative attitudes. How is this possible? Right? So these are kind of like this. And so this is when in the mid-90s, the idea started, we need to develop new measures, implicit measures of prejudice. I explain in a second a little bit more about what an implicit measure is and why it's called implicit measure. Before that, I just want to say, like, there was in the 80s, there were other attempts to kind of solve this problem. What if we give people kind of more indirect questions? So it's not so much that they say, oh, I do not like, for instance, BAME people, or I don't like black people. No, what if we kind of use what's called less reactive questions, where people are not sure, it's like, oh, this could be racism or it could not be racism. And here they kind of have a more license to express their negative feelings towards a group. So it's not that you, for instance, you may say, like, if you're an American and you harbor some ill feelings towards black people, there's like, you can maybe feel licensed to say, oh, blacks are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. You say, like, of course, black and white people have the same rights, they should have the same rights, but I think black people get a little bit too demanding, right? So here you basically have what's called a modern racism, and this is like the items from the modern racism scale, where people are allowed to express their racist attitudes via policy questions. And I actually am quite a fan of that. So here's a recent research that I did that was commissioned by the World Health Organization, where we looked into a little bit like better understanding attitudes towards 3 different groups. In the UK, it was like people from the BAME community, and then it was like men and overweight people, obese people. All of these 3 groups were particularly hit hard by COVID. I think all of them have men, obese, and members of the BAME community have about 2 to 3 times higher likelihood to die of COVID than the average. And what you can see if you look here and in figure B, and ask, okay, how warm do you feel towards in the UK, it was BAME. In the US, it was black. We had 2 representative samples of the UK and the US to look at that. You can see that people explicitly express, for instance, in the UK, the highest warmth and the highest competence ratings from people from black and Asian minority status, right? Compared to men and to obese people who got the lowest rankings, okay? So it seems like, oh, all is good. But then if you looked at, we also gave them the modern racism scale. And what you can see that you had here basically, and this is kind of highlighted, is like you had 25% of people who would express or endorse what I think like kind of pretty obviously racist statements. So you still had quite a larger like a larger group of people who were still kind of they still had racist attitudes. And if you ask them a little bit differently, even in 2000, what is it now, 21, that's when we asked them, you can still get a large percentage of people who think, oh, I think, of course, people from a BAME community in the UK should get the same, right? Like they should, but they shouldn't push too hard, right? And so I think that's quite interesting for me. That was quite sobering. So it still works. So it still works to ask in less reactive ways. Okay. I just want to highlight it. I quite like to measure, I quite like the modern racism scale to catch people who have here otherwise relatively positive attitude towards black people. You can also see that these 2 measures don't really correlate with each other. But then people were not really convinced that this is enough, that these indirect explicit measures, that they would overcome social desirability, that they would help us to measure the true attitude people have. And then about 25 years ago, 2 papers appeared. There was the IAT, the Implicit Association test, with which we will start, and then another test that was actually developed a little bit earlier by Ross Fazio that said, like, oh, we should stop measuring attitudes towards ethnic minorities and so forth by using questions. We should do it via performance. So in psychology, we call something an implicit measure when the performance determines your attitude, okay? So it's not so much anything about the attitude, it's just the way to measure it. An explicit attitude is one where I explicitly ask you a question, you answer it, whereas an implicit attitude is something that I derive from your performance on a test, okay? Whether that's unconscious or not is a completely different question. It could be that it's conscious, could be that it's unconscious, okay? It's just important to kind of keep that separated. There's even within the literature in psychology, there's a lot of really bad writing about these tests. I highly recommend this article that I uploaded about the kind of key insights by Bertram Gawronski, one of the leading researchers into implicit measures, where he kind of shows in detail what we know and what we don't know about these implicit measures. Most of you will know what the IAT is and how the IAT works. I will just quickly walk you through it. I would really strongly suggest that to do it once. There's Project Implicit, which is started by Harvard University. It's still there. It is started, I think it was started by Brian Nosek, one of the people who developed it. And now more than millions, like I think more than like probably 10 millions or so people have done it. You can do the test there on your own. And it's a really interesting experience. I think it's important as a psychologist to have done this test once. It's probably the most influential test we have in psychology, and to experience how difficult or not difficult it is for you. You can take any object, like there's any group, any in-group, any out-group, there are implicit measures now for everything. And it's good to see kind of like how this works for yourself. This will also help you to better understand how these tests work. But in general, you're basically in these tests in the IAT, what they want to see is, can we measure whether you have, for the classic IAT, you have an association with basically white, European American, which is like this kind of slightly euphemistic term for white and good, and African American and bad. Okay, so this is the key. Do you have these two implicit associations? Okay. So how do they do that? Let me walk you through it. This is, oh no, I forgot. I think that's Ted Bundy. No. Who is it, Yasmin? Sorry. He's like,
It's Charles Manson.
yes, Charles Manson. Okay. This is an earlier picture, and now he has a swastika tattooed on his forehead. So let's just assume he's a serial killer, not a very pleasant person, and like an outright Nazi. And I just want to kind of explain to you how he would most likely, what we would see if he would do this implicit association test. Okay. So there are training blocks that I will not describe, but in one, there are two different sets of blocks, which I will show you or which I'm showing you now. So in one set of blocks, you have two keys. You always have a key on the left and a key on the right. And one key here, this is the left key, has two functions. It says, oh, if there's you either have to use this key to say if you see a black person, or if you say something bad, or you have to indicate if you see a white person and something good. So the same button is used for black and bad and white and good. Okay, so if Manson would see the face of this person, then he would indicate black. Okay. And then if he would see this word pleasure, then he would indicate good. Okay. So what you can see in the reactions times now, if people have a really strong implicit connection between white and good and black and bad, as we assume Mr. Manson has, then people should be extremely fast here. They should make very few mistakes, and they should be extremely fast in answering them, because the constant switching between saying, kind of evaluating these words and evaluating faces with these buttons should be relatively easy for them. But then then there comes another training block where you learn the new connection of the keys, and then you do the opposite. Now, white, patient, and bad. I don't know why I put patient there. Okay, whatever. But it's like, I think this is one for doctors. But this is basically white and bad is now, and black and good. And so if a person is like Charles Manson, is racist, then the assumption is that now this will really be slow. Okay, so you will be really struggling to figure this out. And what you can see if you take the difference between the reaction times on all of these trials and direction times on all of these trials, and this gives you the implicit bias. Okay, so if you're relatively faster here compared to here, then it is said you have an implicit bias towards white over black people. Okay, this is what the IAT does. They have a fancy score. I think it's the T-score or something like that, which takes the errors into account as well. But this is how the IAT works. Okay, do it for yourself. I don't know if this was confusing or not, the explanation. It's actually not that hard. And if you do it once for yourself, then you will see. There's another one which was introduced before that by Ross Fazio, where they kind of thought like, oh, maybe we can use a different type of test to measure, because calls it a bona fide pipeline, like a way to get at your real attitudes without asking you. And this was like the first implicit measure. The principle is very similar and pretty easy to explain. What you see is you either see a stereotypical white or black name. Here's Leroy, which is a stereotypical black name in the US. And then you have to say, you see thereafter, so you see this, upsala, you see Leroy, and then you see it, I think, for a little bit less than a second. And then you see flower, and all you have to say is good or bad. Is the flower good or bad? Is that something good or bad? And then you see Leroy, for instance, again, or other words, and then you say something bad, and now you have to say good or bad. Okay? And the idea here is, that if Leroy, if you associate Leroy with something negative, then whenever you hear the name, the negative attitude is activated, which prevents you from quickly processing something positive. But if you have a strong association between Leroy and negative, and then something negative comes, then you're really good at processing negative words thereafter. Okay, so if you kind of do this is white subjects here. You can see the white subjects, and here you can see their reaction times. And so for basically a black picture, the white subjects are relatively fast if it's a negative word thereafter, and relatively slow if it's a positive word thereafter. Okay, and you can use that. So here you can see that somehow there's a processing advantage of negative words when they're preceded by a black face, and a disadvantage for positive words if they're preceded by a black face. And you don't see this different for white faces. Okay, so this is like, there are now tons of them. I think I would just skip through that. This is the effective misattribution procedure. Here's like a name gets activated, then it gets masked, then you see a Chinese character, a Mandarin character, and then you have to say, oh, what did you think about, do you like this character or not? And the idea is that basically if you have a positive association with James, or any other of the many white names or pictures are also used, then you will misattribute the effect that is activated by the word or by the picture towards the Chinese pictogram or a Chinese Mandarin character. So there's another one. I will kind of skip the detailed explanation, but here's basically, you want to see whether you mistake more often a tool for a gun after a black than a white face. This is also developed by Keith Payne, and they use that also to kind of look and try to explain and understand why in the US often black people are more often shot, and then the officers thereafter claim that I thought he was not reaching for his ID, but I thought he was pulling out a gun. And so they took that as inspiration and tested that and developed an implicit measure for that as well. So here you can see what we know. So Project Implicit, the good thing about Project Implicit is that everyone can do it online. So we have now data on the IAT from literally millions of people. This is data from, more than 2 million people have tested themselves on Project Implicit on their IAT. And here you can see, if you do not have a bias, then you're here. Okay, and if you're here, like larger numbers towards this, means you have a negative bias. You have so you prefer white over black people. Okay. Oh, here's also an explanation. Okay. And what you can see is basically men and women have relatively similar biases. You can see what you would expect. The older you get, kind of, the stronger your negative bias. I think this is always really important for me to remember for everyone. I think often in universities, we think that education is the key to everything. Or if we just educate people enough, then they will lose their racist tendencies. But you can see there's no real difference, whether you have a PhD or just a little bit of high school. There's no difference in your implicit bias towards black people. You can also see, maybe it's like, oh, maybe it's kind of like it just measures it not quite well. But you can see the only people who do not on average have in mean do not have a negative bias are Black or African Americans themselves. Okay, so it seems like that everyone else does in the US have, to a certain degree, at least on average, each group have a negative bias. And this is basically the starting point of every bias training. There's like, they come in and say like, oh, we all have it. Let's see how we can handle that. And this is something like an idea that really dominates the political discourse about this. Here's a citation, or like a quote from the article that I just highlighted the figures from. It's like, indeed, it's hard to think of an experiment in social psychology that had such far-reaching impact, right? So this is like one of the kind of I mean, it's not an experiment, but these are journalists, they don't understand. But it's like, basically, it shows us that like it's really permeated our ideas about how racism works, how prejudice works. This is basically, I think here's like in a debate, it's not really essential, but he says like, Donald Trump says like, oh, Hillary Clinton said we all have that bias. How dare she? That's a bad thing. I can't do his accent very, like his like strange way of talking very well. But that's kind of like the idea that just like really reached all levels of society, right? So in our last section, what I want to talk about in the last 10 minutes, or like in the last 7-8 minutes, is to talk a little bit about what do we know about the implicit bias? Does everyone have it? And then let me just start by showing you kind of like the, oopsala, I'm not sure what's going on with my, give me 1 second, with my PowerPoint. So here I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kind of ideas people have about implicit biases or implicit measures, right? Does everyone have it? We come back to it in a second. Is the implicit bias unconscious? These are the two I would like to talk about today. And then in the additional videos, we would talk about, is it stable over time? Does it drive racist behavior? And is it not affected by context? Okay. So the idea here is everyone has this bias in themselves. They're not aware of it. It can't be changed. It's there. It's stable over time. It drives our behavior. And it doesn't really matter whether you measure it in this context or that context. That's the key idea that often anti-bias trainings underlies. And we want to see if that's actually justified and what research for 25 years, massive amounts of research on this topic have produced. I think here it's just kind of like important to note that what you're looking at are average scores, right? This is the question, does everyone have it, right? And then it's like, oh, look at this. On average, like even people who are strongly liberal have this bias. I think what people forget often is that these are also values that are normally distributed, right? If you think about this here and you apply just a normal distribution to the scale, and you're like, okay, this is basically how it kind of looks like. Oh, this is like bad drawing. But then you put this on top of that, right? And you're just like, oh, there's some people here, there's some people here, and here. Then we have the kind of the biggest cluster here. You also know that there are some people who will be really on the other side, right? But it's like within each group, there are some people who have it and some people who do not have it, right? When we average the crazy guys with the people who do not have that, right? Then we kind of, I mean, there's like, and then we have many in the middle. But it's not true that not everyone has it, okay? It really, what we know from research, and we come to this a little bit next week, is in particular, again, when we talk about group behavior, that it really makes a difference whether you, for instance, interact with Black people on a regular basis, and the context of their interactions and the contents of how you think about the other person. So it's not true that everyone has it, but I think it is true that too many have it. Okay, so I think I don't want to kind of leave you with an impression that this is like that. This would not suggest that many of it has it or that it's not a problem. It is, but it's not true that everyone has it. Okay, when I had my anti-bias training at City, or like racism training, the person started with, oh, we all know everyone has it. And then all the economists in the room started debating it. And this was basically, we wasted the whole session on that. and not on anything more productive or helpful. But this is often how anti-bias workshops go. Now let's talk about the last point before we want to close it today, and say like, okay, is the implicit bias unconscious? And for that, we have to look a little bit at the research that is done in this area and how we kind of come up with that. The idea of the unconscious bias was advocated for by the people who also invented it, right? Greenwald, for instance, says research guided by the conceptual roots of the IAT emphasizes the idea that people are unaware of their mental contents underlying their responses on implicit measures. So these are like, okay, we're not aware of our implicit biases. We're not aware that we have them. And why do we think that is the case? Okay, and this is, I show you one experiment, and we will come back to this experiment when we talk about behavior as well, where it's like a classic study where we show this is how we came about this idea that maybe the biases that people show on implicit measures compared to explicit are unconscious. So imagine you come to a study, you're kind of like a typical, this is how I imagine a typical white student to look like. At least if I put it in my icon search, that's what I got. And the first thing that a participant in a research study would do is they would get an attitude towards black scale. Okay, this is the study by Jack Davidio, whom we met earlier, a really good study, really influential study here. And this is what they measured, right? I would rather not have blacks live in the same apartment building I live in, interracial marriage, we talked about it. I think that black people look more similar to each other than white people do. Relatively subtle, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's subtle, but I think maybe in 2002, but it's still explicit attitudes. Then they measured their implicit attitudes. This was done with this kind of, this is this Rob Fazio's measure, where you see a picture for 23 milliseconds that was actually backward masked. So you couldn't really consciously see the picture. And thereafter, you either have like positive or negative words, and then you can kind of measure the implicit bias, whether there is this basically processing advantage of negative words after a black face compared to a white face, okay? So you do this, so they do these two things. The interesting thing why I mentioned this study, and we come back to this study, they also then measure how they interact with black people, how others perceive them interacting with black people, and how the black people perceive them to interact with them. So we can use that also to illustrate how it influences behavior. But here what we see, right, in this first kind of result in the study is that there's no real correlation between the explicit and the implicit. So whether I say kind of explicitly, I have no problems with black people, I'm not a racist, etc., it does not impact whether my performance on the implicit measure. And that's something that has been repeated again and again and again. There's like overall a generally low correlation between implicit and explicit measures. And so hence people kind of concluded, okay, so that's when people concluded, and they would say something like, okay, it seems like that people are not aware of them. When we explicitly ask them, they say, I'm not a racist, and then I give them that. And so there's this tradition now that kind of differentiates between these modern or aversive racists, basically kind of like liberal racists, who have explicitly no negative attitudes towards racial minorities, but implicitly they do, right? And this is basically the assumption when you go to an anti-bias workshop, that this underlies the behavior that drives it, that there are all these well-meaning people, but they have this bias in them that drives them towards this behavior. Traditional or old school racists would have negative attitudes, explicit and implicit. Okay, somebody like Charles Manson would be a traditional or old school racist. Okay. One study that's kind of like that becomes like, or I think one thing that's really apparent is that it seems to be almost like they're measuring two things, right? If you explicitly ask me something and then I do the IAT, it doesn't really seem that the correlation should be necessarily high because the attitude object seems to be a little bit different. And this is something, and it's like, I just want to show you a starting point of research by Adam Hahn and colleagues, where they actually let people do IATs for racial minorities, for women, I think for rich people or celebrities as well. It's on the next slide. And then they let them beforehand or thereafter predict their performance. So I said, like, what do you think this shows us? How did you do on this test, right? Are you aware of your bias when doing this, right? And you can see, if this slide would advance, that here you have the predicted scores, and it's the last slide for today. And here you have the actual IAT scores. And you can see that for Black, for Asian, for Latino, for celebrities and children, people predict basically the same performance they show. They had a very, very good understanding of their implicit biases. Okay, so it seems like that if I ask you directly on this test, what is your attitude? What is your bias? People are aware of that. But we don't ask them that. We ask them a different question. We ask them, do you think of yourself as a racist? And then people say no. So like, I'm aware of this, that there's this weird performance going on, but I'm not a racist. Okay. So this is like the first lesson. There's no evidence that people are unaware of the implicit biases. There's other research to support that, but it's important to keep in mind that we are, or at least we have the capabilities to be aware of these implicit biases. Okay, I'd like to stop it here, and then maybe I stop the recording. And then I will have a look in the chat. I saw there are several questions, and then we can kind of transition to the office hour and talk about these questions.